different elements in order to have sort of a logical way to focus your deliberation. So I encourage you to do that, but you can do it any way you want. Okay. Second element, that the defendant caused the death of George Floyd. Okay. Causations. What does that mean? What does causation mean here? It means that the defendant's act or acts were a substantial causal factor in causing the death. He's criminally liable for all of the consequences of his actions that naturally occur, right? Including those consequences brought about by intervening causes. The fact that other causes may have contributed to George Floyd's death just does not relieve the defendant of criminal liability. You have to find is that 9 minutes and 29 seconds of compression on his knee, with his knees on his neck and on his back, being held down, was a substantial factor in George Floyd's death. Now, if there was a superseding cause, then the defendant wouldn't be criminally liable. But the superseding cause, those are causes that come after the defendant's acts and alters the natural sequences of events, and is the sole cause of death. And we don't have that here. We know how George Floyd died. This is the use of force. When we talk about use of force, that's been defined by the different witnesses who've testified, looking at what happened from the point the knee went to the neck and back, and the unlawful restraint, the assault started, and how long it lasted, 9 minutes and 29 seconds. That's what killed George Floyd. That's why he died. You believe your eyes, that unreasonable force pinning him to the ground, that's what killed him. This was a homicide. Oh, you heard this from forensic pathologists, the experts. You've heard this, and the experts have weighed in. And Dr. Langenfeld told you that Mr. Floyd died. Dr. Baker ruled this a homicide and told you the cause and manner of death, the unlawful, the restraint and subdual by law enforcement. What they did killed him. Told you that. Dr. Tobin, remember Dr. Tobin? He told you specifically how it happened. He walked you through that, the asphyxia. Right? He told you how it happened. And the other doctors who testified, Dr. Smock, Dr. Rich, Dr. Eisenschmidt, they told you how it didn't happen. Right? It wasn't a sudden cardiac event. It wasn't a heart attack. It wasn't a drug overdose. Right? It wasn't any of those things. Right? Dr. Tobin came back and explained it wasn't carbon monoxide. Right? No. So you know how George Floyd died, and you heard this, but specifically, Dr. Tobin provided fairly extensive detail and was very clear that George Floyd died as a result of a low level of oxygen. This low level of oxygen caused a brain injury and a PEA arrhythmia, which caused his heart to stop. That's not a cardiac event. It's not that his heart disease, right, that didn't cause him to die. It was the low level of oxygen. It was the asphyxia that caused him to die. Okay? And we know that happened. We know that happened because they observed during the restraint at 20:24:21, right? What they observed? They observed an anoxic seizure, right? A telltale sign of oxygen deprivation. Dr. Tobin told you that. Even Dr. Fowler told you that. And after Mr. Floyd experienced a seizure, he passed out. After his pulse stopped, his heart stopped. That cardiopulmonary arrest, that was the result of the police subdual and the restraint and the neck compression. And we know from Dr. Tobin, George Floyd did not die primarily from a cardiac event, as has been suggested. Now, George Floyd, he was not in perfect health. Sure, he had narrowed arteries, high blood pressure, no question about that. He was experiencing stress, even before the officers shoved him onto the sidewalk unnecessarily, gratuitously, disproportionately. But none of this caused George Floyd's heart to fail. It did not. His heart failed because the defendant's use of force, the 929, okay, that deprived Mr. Floyd of the oxygen that he needed, that humans need to live. And Dr. Tobin knows because he is a pulmonologist. He's a lung doctor. He's a lung doctor. He's also a respiratory physiologist. He's the only person who testified who was able to calculate lung capacity, lung volume. And he could do that. Dr. Baker couldn't do it. Didn't do it. He deferred to the pulmonologist, Dr. Tobin. Dr. Fowler couldn't do it. He said he would defer to a pulmonologist. And Dr. Tobin, who also happens to be a critical care physician, he spent years treating patients in intensive care who were experiencing respiratory failure. And Dr. Tobin literally wrote the book on the subject, and he was able to tell you, right, what this looks like, what he was able to observe. What he was able to observe was oxygen deprivation. It was asphyxia. It was asphyxia. Because under the conditions that Mr. Floyd was being restrained, that the defendant put him in, okay, that cut off his oxygen, it would have cut off the oxygen of someone who was perfectly healthy, of anyone. The forces that were used in this situation, right, it involved multiple factors. George Floyd was handcuffed. And he had impaired arms and chest movement. He was placed prone, shoved prone on the sidewalk. The knees pushing on his neck and back downward. The pavement, the force of the pavement being unyielding. It was like he was in a vice. That he was being, squeezed in a vice. And he calculated, right, between Chauvin, the defendant, Officer King, pushing down on him approximately 90 pounds of force. And the position and the force combined such that it was as if George Floyd's left lung had been surgically removed. That's how much of a reduction of air capacity there was here. To the point that Mr. Floyd was desperately trying to make space to breathe, pushing his shoulder, pushing his face against the pavement to lift up, to give space to breathe. His lung capacity, based on Dr. Tobin's calculation, had just being in the prone position, even though you heard some studies from the defense saying, the prone position isn't dangerous. Well, Dr. Tobin disagreed. He said that the lung capacity was reduced by 24% just by the prone position, 43% when you consider the additional pressure. Now, Dr. Tobin's opinion corroborates the police training and what the police have known for 30 years. Okay? That there's a danger to the prone position, and the danger is positional asphyxia. And the danger, the worst thing that can happen with positional asphyxia is death. And it wasn't just the lungs, the pressing up against the neck. Remember when you touch that it reduced the capacity of airflow such that it was as if Mr. Floyd was breathing through a straw. Right? These shallow breaths did not produce enough oxygen. Not enough oxygen could get to the lungs. And that's what killed George Floyd. And here's what didn't, right? This wasn't a sudden cardiac arrhythmia, right? Dr. Smock told you that. Dr. Thomas, Dr. Rich, Dr. Tobin, they agree. Not a sudden cardiac arrhythmia. That's not how this looks. Dr. Baker, no medical evidence of a heart attack. Okay. We heard from Dr. Rich. Dr. Rich actually treats people who have heart attacks, and he found there was nothing in his review, nothing in George Floyd's heart to suggest that the death originated from the heart. Nothing. Over the course of this case, you heard a lot of things that didn't happen and hypotheticals that don't apply. Right? You know why George Floyd died. You know how he died. You heard a lot about drugs. You heard about his struggle with addiction. There's some things, George Floyd was obviously not a perfect man. Who is? No one is. Right? So you heard about drugs. You heard about drugs in the car, some pills in the car, in the squad car, in his car. You heard questions about, is he chewing gum? Does he have a pill in his mouth based on his free? None of that matters. Because you know what his level, the drug level was. You know that from the toxicology report. If drugs are found in the car, they're not in George Floyd's system. So there's no point in talking about those. Right? Let's talk about what was in his system and the toxicology report. And you heard from Dr. Eisenschmidt, right? And what he testified was that George Floyd's fentanyl to norfentanyl ratio, that the metabolite norfentanyl, that was well below the ratio of people who die from a fentanyl overdose. It was even below the median. And George Floyd's methamphetamine level, that was 94% lower than the group for driving, population for driving under the influence. Right? And Dr. Rich and Dr. Smock, they treated patients who were under the influence of both fentanyl